You know the names Cain, Abel, and Seth, but what about their sisters? The Bible tells us Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters, yet not a single daughter is named, not a single story told. Why? What happened to the first women born on earth? Today we step into a forgotten world, a world where scripture falls silent, but the story still speaks, if we're willing to listen. This is the never-told story about the daughters of Adam and Eve, a story buried in the shadows of Genesis and preserved in ancient writings few have ever explored. Their names were Avan and Azura, and through them we rediscover a truth lost to time, that the foundation of humanity was not built by men alone. These women carried legacy, bore nations, and helped shape the earliest chapters of God's plan. Before we begin, if you're passionate about uncovering hidden biblical truths and giving voice to the stories long overlooked, I invite you to like this video to help it reach more truth seekers. Comment below and let me know, have you ever heard of Avan and Azura? Subscribe for more powerful scripture-rooted content, and share this video with someone who needs to hear the part of Genesis history that was never told. Now, let us begin the journey back to Eden, to the soil where life began, and to the women whose names deserve to be remembered. In the beginning, creation was pure, unblemished, untouched, alive with divine intent. The earth breathed under the gaze of its maker, and from the dust rose Adam, the first man shaped in the image of God. From his side came Eve, the woman, equal in essence, formed not from the earth but from living flesh, destined to be the mother of all who would come after. Together they walked in Eden, clothed in innocence, their steps unburdened by shame. But temptation entered the garden like a shadow, and with one act of defiance, the world fell. Innocence gave way to exile. Paradise closed behind them, and the soil, once tender, hardened beneath their feet. Outside the garden, Adam and Eve began again. They worked the ground, they bore children, and the first human story unfolded not in triumph but in tragedy. The scriptures speak of Cain, their firstborn, strong, defiant, a man of the field whose offering was rejected. They speak of Abel, gentle and faithful, whose sacrifice pleased God but whose life was cut short by his brother's envy. And then they speak of Seth, the child given in place of Abel, the one through whom the righteous line would continue. Their names are remembered, passed down through generations, etched into sacred history. But then in Genesis chapter 5 verse 4, a subtle thread appears, delicate, easy to miss. After he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters, other sons and daughters. With those few words, the biblical record moves on. No names are given, no stories told, no genealogies traced. The daughters of Adam and Eve vanish as quickly as they appear, their existence acknowledged but their identities left in silence. In a book so meticulous in recording the lifespans and lineages of patriarchs, the absence of these daughters is striking. Their omission does not suggest they were unimportant. Rather, it reflects a world that preserved history through male descent, where the contributions of women, though vital, were often left unspoken. Yet these daughters lived. They were born under the same sky as Cain and Abel. They gathered water from the rivers, kneaded grain into bread, and tended to the needs of the first human families. They carried life within them and raised the earliest generations of mankind. Their hands shaped the homes, their hearts bore the grief of Eden's loss, and their strength helped sustain humanity in a world still learning how to survive. Though the scriptures do not name them, their presence is woven into every line that speaks of growth, of birth, of multitudes spreading across the earth. Civilization was not built by men alone. It was carried forward by mothers, sisters, and daughters whose names have been forgotten, but whose role was foundational. To remember them now is not to rewrite the sacred text, but to hear what it already whispered, that the daughters of Adam and Eve were there at the beginning. And while their stories were never told in full, their lives were real, their labor essential, and their legacy enduring. Their silence is not a void, it is an invitation to look deeper, to ask the questions that history passed over, and to honor the women who helped shape the dawn of the human story. This is where their story begins, not in the verses written, but in the ones left unwritten. Theirs is the never-told story, waiting to be remembered. While the canonical scriptures fall silent on the identities of Adam and Eve's daughters, Other ancient writings carry their memory forward, tenderly preserved in the shadows of tradition. Among these, the Book of Jubilees stands out as a treasured source, often referred to as Little Genesis for its retelling of early biblical history with expanded detail and spiritual insight. Though not included in the Hebrew Bible, the Book of Jubilees was held in high esteem by many early Jewish and Christian communities. It remains part of the sacred canon in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a living testimony to voices once hushed but never wholly lost. In its pages, the silence of Genesis is broken. There we find names never recorded in the biblical genealogies, yet full of meaning and memory. Among Adam and Eve's daughters, two are revealed, Avan and Azura. These are not names invented for embellishment. They are fragments of ancestral remembrance, passed down, preserved and cherished. They represent more than bloodline. They carry the story of womanhood at the dawn of creation. Avan and Azura are not merely inserted to complete the family tree. Their presence in Jubilees gives weight to a truth often overlooked, that the formation of humanity's earliest generations was not the work of men alone. These daughters, though absent from the canonical spotlight, played vital roles in the survival, growth, and sacred lineage of humankind. Their names are like hidden stones in the foundation of creation, silent but strong. Their remembrance opens a doorway into the never-told story, revealing that even in a world reeling from the loss of Eden, God's plan included the strength, presence, and purpose of women. To read their names is to feel the veil lift, if only slightly, from a history too often told in half. In Avan and Azura, we begin to recover the faces of those long overlooked, the daughters of Adam and Eve, who stood at the cradle of the human race, yet vanished from the pages of Scripture without a word. But they were not forgotten, not entirely, and in the quiet witness of Jubilees, their story begins to speak again. Among the daughters of Adam and Eve, two names rise from the ancient echoes, Avan and Azura. Though absent from the canonical scriptures, their stories emerge through the pages of the Book of Jubilees like buried treasures brought back to light. These women, largely forgotten by history, were not minor footnotes in the human story. They were builders of nations, wombs of legacy, pillars of a world just beginning. Avan, a daughter of the first woman, was given in marriage to her brother Cain. In the modern world, such a union would be unthinkable, but in the first generations of humanity, where no other families walked the earth, these early relationships were not acts of rebellion, but of survival. In a world newly cast from Eden, where the dust still remembered paradise, life had to spring from the only seed God had planted. But Avan's path was a dark one. She was joined to a man marked by blood, a man whose hands had taken the life of his own brother. Cain, once the tiller of soil, had become a wanderer, cursed from the ground, driven from the presence of God. Yet even in exile he was not alone. Avan went with him. To stand beside Cain was to shoulder shame. To walk with him was to carry the weight of sorrow and judgment. Yet it was through Avan that Cain's lineage continued. She bore Enoch, the firstborn of their union, a child whose name Cain gave to a city, perhaps in a desperate act of redemption, a gesture to build rather than destroy. Avan became more than a wife. She became a mother of innovation. Through her children and their descendants, the early world witnessed the rise of agriculture, the birth of music, the shaping of tools and crafts, cornerstones of civilization. While Cain is remembered for his crime, Avan is remembered in silence, her name tucked into forgotten books, her legacy passed on in every field sown and every tool forged. She was a figure of quiet resilience. Her story is the story of enduring after the fall, of building amid ruin, of mothering nations while history forgot to record her name. Azura's story is one marked by sorrow and sacred purpose. She was once promised to Abel, the righteous son whose offerings pleased God. In him, Azura would have found a partner of peace and holiness, a man whose heart walked in step with the Creator. But before their union could be fulfilled, tragedy struck. Cain's rage silenced Abel's life, and with it shattered Azura's future. What was meant to be a home became mourning. What was prepared in hope dissolved in grief. Yet even from ashes, God writes new beginnings. In the wake of Abel's death, another son was born to Adam and Eve. His name was Seth, meaning appointed, a sign that the divine plan had not been broken. In time, Azura became his wife. But this was no ordinary marriage. It was the merging of grief and promise, the continuation of a line chosen not by strength, but by faith. From Azura and Seth came Enosh, and with him, the spark of spiritual revival. It was in his days that people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Through their descendants would come Noah, and through Noah, the preservation of the human race when judgment fell in a flood. Azura, who once stood on the edge of despair, became the mother of redemption's line. Her womb carried the promise that would one day lead to covenant, to rescue, to grace. Her name may be forgotten in Scripture's genealogy, but her legacy lives in every righteous generation that followed. She was not merely Seth's bride, she was a bridge between loss and renewal, between Eden's exile and heaven's promise. The lives of Avan and Azura do more than fill the genealogical gaps of early humanity. They open a window into the complex moral and theological landscape of a world still trembling from Eden's fall. In a time when humanity existed as a single family, intra-family unions were not scandalous, they were essential. With no nations, no tribes, and no strangers, the divine command to be fruitful and multiply could only be fulfilled through those who shared both blood and burden. Yet beyond this practical necessity lies a deeper truth. Avan and Azura symbolize the hidden strength of women in sacred history, figures who moved quietly through the shadows of patriarchal storytelling, yet whose contributions were foundational. They were not simply passive participants in the unfolding drama of Genesis, they were mothers of generations, their bodies bearing the future, their hands shaping the rhythm of early human life. Avan's union with Cain does not erase the stain of his crime, but it does speak of mercy in motion. Through her, a murderer's legacy was not defined by bloodshed alone, but by the birth of cities, cultures, and crafts. She is proof that even in cursed soil, God can bring forth fruit. Azura's story too carries divine echo. Though her heart was shattered by Abel's death, her life did not end in mourning. By becoming the bride of Seth, she became the link between paradise lost and the line through which God would preserve his covenant. Her sorrow was not discarded, it was redeemed. In a narrative often dominated by male names, achievements, and failures, the presence of these women reminds us that biblical history was never solely patriarchal. It was quietly matriarchal too. Behind every recorded name there was a woman who labored in silence. Behind every promise passed from father to son, there was a mother who carried that promise first in her womb. Avan and Azura may not speak through direct words in Scripture, but their lives speak nonetheless. They remind us that God's story has always included the unseen, the unnamed, and the uncelebrated, and that behind the visible structure of history stands a hidden scaffolding of women whose strength bore the weight of the world. To rediscover the daughters of Adam and Eve is not merely to recover forgotten names, it is to reclaim a missing part of our shared spiritual heritage. Their stories may lie in the margins of Scripture, obscured by silence and tradition, but they are not lost. Like buried roots beneath a great tree, their presence has always supported the visible branches of history. The mention of daughters in Genesis chapter 5 verse 4 is not accidental. It is a quiet clue, a divine breadcrumb, leading us to look beyond what is written and consider what was lived. These women, unnamed by the canon but remembered in ancient tradition, invite us to search the hidden places, to ask what else we may have overlooked, and to re-examine what we think we know about the beginning. In doing so, we come to see that the silence in the Bible is not absence, it is invitation. An invitation to seek not just facts but forgotten voices. An invitation to wonder, not just at what was recorded but at what was lived. An invitation to uncover, not to rewrite Scripture, but to embrace the fuller story it whispers beneath the surface. An invitation to remember, because in remembering, we restore dignity to the ones history allowed to fade. When we speak the names Avan and Azura, we breathe life into the legacy of countless women whose strength shaped the early world. We honor the divine image in all humanity, not only in the patriarchs whose names were preserved, but in the daughters whose quiet faithfulness helped fulfill God's purpose from the beginning. To explore their story is not to stray from Scripture, but to see its deeper richness. And in doing so, we affirm a sacred truth. Every daughter matters, even if history forgot to write her name. Because sometimes the truth that changes us most is the one no one ever thought to tell. Avan and Azura may have been forgotten by history, but this was their story. the never-told story about the daughters of Adam and Eve. The names Avan and Azura may not be familiar, but their legacy runs deep. They remind us that history is not always recorded by the loudest voices, but often carried by those who labored in silence. They walked the same earth as Cain and Abel. They bore the same curse. They nurtured the same generations. And though the world forgot to speak their names, God never forgot their part in his story. Today their memory has been stirred. Their story, once hidden, has been brought into the light. If this journey has opened your eyes, stirred your heart, or deepened your understanding, I invite you to help others discover the truth as well. Like this video to support our work. Leave a comment. What stood out to you most? What questions does this raise for you? Subscribe to this channel for more powerful, truth-centered biblical stories. And share this message with someone who needs to hear the story behind the silence. Thank you so much for watching, for seeking, and for remembering the ones the world forgot. Your time, attention, and hunger for truth mean more than words can say. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded in Scripture, and never stop uncovering the stories waiting to be heard.